Thank you also to Dr. Mark for today's great opportunity. Like our first speaker, we have prepared a paper also, but we have mixed it up a little bit today and have come up with a bit of a presentation that we have utilised in past circumstances to share with you about this particular initiative. So integrated case management, just before we get into some of the detail of it, I will just, I want to acknowledge a couple of people who are essentially the brains behind this framework. Sandy Piper, who is the manager of our Moreton Youth Justice Service Centre, and Alec Jones, who is a consultant forensic psychologist. They worked tirelessly for some time putting this framework together, and they trialled it at our Caboolture Youth Justice Service Centre for a period of time with some great outcomes for young people in the community before we commenced the initiative last year. So just a little bit of background, and Joe has probably set the scene for me very well in terms of some of the things that were going on in Townsville over the last few years. Joe took us back to 2014. I won't go back just that far, but certainly 2016 was a very significant period of time within Townsville in terms of some of the concerns that were being raised by the community about youth crime. Joe talked about perceptions of crime being out of control, and we also all read the newspaper about Townsville being dubbed as the crime capital of Queensland. In response to some of those initiatives, the Queensland Government announced, as Joe spoke about, a 5-point plan. One of those initiatives related to the established policing and the RAP, but from a human service perspective, one of those initiatives was referred to as the Community Youth Response Initiative. ICM, I will refer to it as ICM today, just it'll be easier for my tongue today, but ICM was one of 5 initiatives that sits under Community Youth Response. Some of the just before we get to that, I'll talk briefly about a couple of those that started. The Specialist High Risk Youth Corps was one of the major initiatives that the department rolled out at that time in an effort to specifically respond to a very small cohort of young people who the community was most concerned about in terms of youth offending. An after-hours diversion service, you may have heard around the community and certainly read in the paper about the Lighthouse service. That is a service that is funded to deliver an after-hours service for young people. It operates from 6 p.m. at night until about 8 a.m. the next morning, specifically in response to concerns that we were hearing at that time about the number of young people who were not at home at all hours of the night, who perhaps didn't have a place of safety and who needed some support and engagement in positive, structured activities to divert them from offending. A third component of the Community Youth Response Initiative was a cultural mentoring program. And that program has probably morphed a little bit over time. It initially started with Uncle Alfred Smallwood working in the community as one elder and as part of his men's group to provide a cultural mentoring service for young people in the justice system, and it has now morphed and grown into a far larger cultural mentoring program known as YINDA. The fourth component was some funding to support an alternative education program. By coincidence, today, Dr. Glenn Dawes is in the room today, and I do want to acknowledge Glenn and his wife, Christine, who were the brains behind the alternative education program well over a decade ago. That program is known as the Beauregard program. It started about 15 years ago and was a concept by Glenn's wife, who was at that time, the principal at the Cleveland Education and Training Centre. Since then, Glenn has done some research and some evaluation of that program. I'm pleased to say that it's gone on to great things, and under this initiative has been funded with a teacher to specifically provide an intensive education program for young people in the justice system who are the most hard to reach, who are the most disengaged, and who require intensive support. From a youth justice perspective, we also contribute a youth worker to support that initiative. And the final component of the Community Youth Response Initiative, the one that we'll talk to you about today, is integrated case management. Just before we get to some of that detail, I do want to highlight, I guess, putting youth crime into perspective. And Joe talked about social media. And that has certainly been one of the key factors, I suppose, in raising the community's level of concern and their anxiety about youth crime. But when we look at the data, it is a bit of a different picture. So if I go back to the 2016 census, roughly 31,000 young people between the ages of 10 and 19 in the catchment area that the Townsville North and the Townsville Youth and Townsville South Youth Justice Service Centres cover. Less than 1% of that 31,000 are young people that are engaged with us as an agency within the youth justice space. ICM works with an even smaller cohort of kids, okay? By its very nature, integrated and intensive case management, that program, that framework, works with 20 kids who are assessed as high risk of future offending. You will note that we've got many researchers in the room today, but research tells us that typically a very small cohort of kids are responsible for 50% of most offending. So when we read about things in the paper, when we hear about concern from the community about youth crime being out of control, we are talking about a very small cohort of kids. For Townsville, as I said, through ICM we work with 20, but that small cohort who commit generally 50% of offending is approximately 30 or 40 kids. So ICM, it commenced in Townsville in February 2017 and is funded until June 2019. In fact, all of those initiatives that I spoke about a few moments ago are all funded under that framework until June 2019. Using ICM as a framework, and I want to keep referring to it as a framework, not a program. This is not, ICM is not a tool that you can simply work with young people and families with, step them through a series of modules over a 26-week period and offending drops. It is a human service framework for working with young people who are most at risk of offending. Using it as a framework, staff, youth justice caseworker staff and a support worker will work with no more than 5 young people per person. Okay, so under the framework we were funded 4 caseworkers to work with a cohort of 20. It's a very small number. But we know from the research that if we can make an impact in terms of reduced offending for that group of 20, whether it is frequency or severity, we will have a significant reduction of crime committed by young people within our community. Under the model, the caseworker is the case manager, and the FICRO, or the support worker, works in collaboration with the caseworker to meet the identified needs of the young person and the family. I spoke about another trial site, or another site in Caboolture, where ICM first started, but certainly since then we are seeing ICM grow across the state. There's a number of sites within our Brisbane North and Brisbane South catchment and in other places across Queensland as well. So what is ICM? It is certainly not a program, but it is delivered on an individualised basis over a 6 to 12 month period with a small cohort of kids who are high risk. At the end of that 12-month period, we transition young people back to our general case management framework. Why six or to 12 months? Again, we know that the research, it's pretty clear that interventions delivered to people in the justice system, certainly young people in the justice system, need to be of an appropriate length. 26 weeks is a very key window for us in the youth crime space, hence why the minimum period of intervention for young people using ICM is a 6-month period. Where did we get it from? Well, we got it from Caboolture, but it wasn't just made up. It wasn't someone just having a good idea. In fact, it was based on significant research into into what we know works in the youth justice space. ICM is an adaptation of a few different theoretical frameworks, multi-systemic therapy, the good lies model, and collaborative family work all form the framework of how we work with young people under an ICM model. Importantly, it is strengths-based. It is action-orientated, outcome-focused, and relationship-centred. Hayley will talk to us a little bit later on about the hub model, but the hub model is critical in terms of the youth justice caseworker not only just coordinating service delivery for young people using this framework, but being a key person for that young person, having a strong relationship where we can challenge young people about their offending. So aims and objectives, most importantly and very consistently with our role as a youth justice agency, the primary concept driving ICM as a framework is about a reduction in crime. We are also, of course, we know that if we're going to assist young people to address their offending, we need to enhance functioning within families, promote pro-social engagement for young people in educational and vocational pathways, address their substance misuse, and reduce out-of-home placements. So using the Community Youth Response Initiative more broadly, having programs like Beauregard, having initiatives like cultural mentoring, having activities for young people that are structured, that are planned, like the Lighthouse Service, all support our work that we are doing using ICM to enhance functioning, reduce substance misuse, and re-engage young people back in education.
So integrated case management, again, is a framework that supports collaborative practice, integrated and intensive case management with both the young people and their families and kinship systems. It requires an intensive assessment phase, which includes offence profiling to identify the patterns and causality of their offending, so that we can design an individualised intervention plan to address and reduce their risk of reoffending and enhance the young person's capacity for pro-social engagement. It allows an appropriate amount of service intensity to address the client needs, hence the small case size number of only 5 young people and their families per caseworker. It is quite resource intensive. It also includes therapeutic work with families based on their offence profiling, as I've already mentioned, the assessment, and the ICM caseworker will deliver a minimum of 2 individualised offence-focused sessions with the young person and a minimum of 1 family therapy session per week. Again, very resource intensive, which points to why there's only 5 young people and their families per caseload. As I've already said, it works with the young person and their family specifically. Lots of research, as you all know, indicates that not only do we have to address the young person, but also the situational needs in their family to be able to make some behavioural change and facilitate behavioural change. Importantly, it's a voluntary framework. Young people and their families have to provide consent after being informed about the intensity and the length of period of the program to be able to work with us. Also, just on that note, obviously there's lots of young people who are still very high risk of reoffending who wouldn't consent to this program, and we would still obviously provide intensive case management to those young people as opposed to integrated case management, and I'll point to some of those differences later. Each young person is afforded up to 36 hours of intervention per week, as dependent on their intervention plan and coordinated by their case manager.
Hayley mentioned about ICM being resource intensive. It is. However, we have certainly been funded quite well, really, to provide, as a manager, a public servant, normally we're not saying those sorts of things, but we have been funded really quite well. There has been a great response to supporting this initiative with an appropriate levels of staffing. Just to name a couple of key positions, we obviously have a team leader that was funded. Importantly, there is a registered psychologist attached to this team, and we've spoken about caseworkers and support staff. So it is a reasonably large team. It is spread across 2 service centres, the Townsville North and the Townsville South Youth Justice Service Centres, working with that cohort of 20. Okay. And just as noted, it's, small caseloads are essential aspect of the program integrity to achieve success and allow for integrated and intensive case management to be provided. Okay.
So who is involved? We have the case managers, youth workers who provide support and work in tandem with the case managers, supervisors, team leaders such as myself, our psychologist, and there may very well be counsellors or other clinicians within ancillary services that the young person is involved with that also work alongside us. Families, caregivers and kinship networks, recognising that families look different to lots of different young people and needing to identify who the key people for those young people are to work with. Community agencies, government and non-government, and of course courts and stakeholders. Community, family, government and non-government providers, case managers, youth workers and the psychologists or counsellors all form part of the Therapeutic Alliance, which is integral in being able to facilitate any kind of behavioural change with these young people. So of course, there is a target group and a selection process. As I've mentioned before, it's voluntary. Not all young people are suitable to be able to participate in the framework. To be eligible to participate in the framework, they must have multiple proven court outcomes, high risk of reoffending, age between 11 to 17 years, assessed as high or very high across multiple domains, such as family and community education, substance use, the most logical ones. They may be subject to child safety intervention, and substance use is often one of the biggest risk factors we see involved with our young people. There are some exclusions, however. Obviously, if the young person and the family don't provide consent, psychiatric illnesses, sexual offences. If they are on a lengthy term of detention, obviously it's very hard to facilitate change in an artificial environment when they're not in their home environment in the community, or if they're on adult orders. So it still takes into account the risk, needs and responsivity and research around the damage of escalating someone through the system. So if a young person is assessed as a low risk, we certainly wouldn't be providing this intensive integrated type of framework in our case management.
And similarly, even though young people can be high risk in terms of future offending, their needs might be high. They might also be quite responsive to other interventions that are being delivered through general case management and through the support of other stakeholders and agencies within the community. So it is about, we have to be a little bit purist, I suppose, in terms of where we put our resources. We do have limited resources. We want to make sure that we get this right, that we deliver the interventions to the young people that need it the most and the young people that the community is most concerned about. So if they are, yes, they might be high risk, but they are engaging, their motivation for change is good, then we would continue on the normal path rather than re-engaging young people in an ICM framework.
As mentioned before, there's a therapeutic aspect to the framework, and it's the psychological counselling and the family therapy. So the case manager, alongside a psychologist or counsellor, will work collaboratively to examine the client's psychosocial offending history within the Youth Justice Assessment Framework, assess the mental health issues, to consider any diagnostic assessments or criteria or psychometric testing requirements. And often we find that lots of our young people have early disengagement from schooling, and lots of these issues have been slipping through the cracks, getting missed. So an important aspect of the model and of us being able to have a psychologist on staff is to be able to address that huge gap with some of these young people. Identifying the ancillary network services required to support the young person and their families, and assisting them in family-led decision-making and goal setting. So assisting them in setting realistic life goals, utilising the philosophy of the Good Lives model within the framework of their criminogenic need and setting achievable action plans. Obviously monitoring their process and revising that if required, and whilst maintaining the appropriate intervention strategies to ensure that and ensuring consistent communication between young people, families, practitioners and network services. So it really focuses on role clarification, the belief that the caseworker can assist the young person and the family to identify issues and develop effective problem-solving capacities. Pro-social modelling, the caseworker and youth worker in tandem, modelling and reinforcing pro-social cognitions, emotions and behaviours. And like I've just touched on, the problem solving. So working on client and family identified problems and establishing client-centred goals.
I think we've heard from some other speakers about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children or people within the justice system, and certainly within the youth justice system. We don't have to read too far to find plenty of research and evidence that supports that. If we go and have a look at 2015, 2016, young people made up about almost 8% of the Queensland population, and 55%, however, 55% of young people currently who are subject to youth justice orders are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. We know from the work that we are doing within ICM and from plenty of research is that trauma experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children as a result of past policies, government intervention, displacement and forced separation has had a significant and psychological impact for those young people. Through ICM, because we have lower caseloads, we have certainly finding that the type of trauma, the severity of that trauma, and the frequency of that trauma is significant. When we think about why young people within the justice system, trauma is sitting there essentially as the backbone of why kids are involved in the justice system. How do we address that and how do we move forward? Well, we need to address those factors and address the trauma, address the factors that have led to that young person coming into contact with the justice system.
We also need to make sure that with every framework we're applying a cultural lens, and how we do this is we actually have an Indigenous reference group within our work group that we're able to consult to ensure that we're working sensitively and culturally appropriately with the families that we're working with.
Linking young people in also with elders within our community, using cultural mentoring programs, assertively seeking out Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff are key factors of how we ensure that we are delivering a framework for young people which is culturally appropriate and delivered in a manner that is culturally competent.
The hub concept of case management, as we mentioned before, this is integral to the integrated case management framework. This activity is initially undertaken with the case manager being the primary and most frequent point of contact. They're the hub of the operation, providing initial referrals, monitoring and ongoing support for the young person and the family in their interactions with the ancillary agencies. And the plan is to provide the young person and their support networks with the confidence to further develop these community-based helping associations as a life skill. So the emphasis is on the personal, so it focuses on not just a good life, but your good life created by you. And it's talking about seeing the family as a partner, not a client, and the worker as a facilitator, not an expert. So things to remember. The emphasis is not on resistant clients or the families and kinship networks, but on the capacity of the team to reflect on and analyse their practice and review the motivation, engagement and strategies of interventions to meet with the needs of the individuals and client or families with ICM. So meeting the family where they're at. There might be many things that need addressing within the family, but what's important to them and what's going to get the most buy-in for them is going to be the family-led decision making that the group needs to work with. And obviously program integrity is essential. So It requires experienced case managers to work with no more than 5 young people and their families at any one time to ensure that the work that needs to be done is able to be carried out.
Yep. Just in terms of that first point about resistant clients, I suppose in a human service perspective, and certainly when you work in a statutory organisation, resistant clients is a word that can come up at different times, and we will hear things sometimes about they won't engage. I can't, they're not coming to appointments, they won't connect with me, etc., etc. ICM, as Hayley said, it flips it on its head. It's not about that client being resistant, but about what can we and what can other stakeholders do to reflect on our practice. What are the things that we could do differently to engage with that client? If strategy A, B, C, D is not working, well, let's have a look at F, G, H, etc. That's the intent. When you look at young people who are the most complex, that the community is most concerned about, they are also the most hard to reach. They are the kids who fall through the gaps. They are the kids who have fallen out of education at a very young age. They are the kids who are using substances, but you can never get to an appointment. ICM encourages and provides a framework for us to do our business differently, to be constantly thinking about how we can flip things on their head, change our approach, and provide an assertive outreach framework. So when I say assertive too, it's not, I guess for those, perhaps for some of the students, assertive is about us constantly following up with families, not doing 2, 3, 4, 5 home visits and they weren't home. Well, we will go back a 6th time, or we will try a different approach to reach clients. They are the kids who are most hard to reach and the kids that the community is most concerned about.
It's also about workers. If a young person isn't able to make their appointment with the psychologist or an AOD worker, the caseworker attending in their place to maintain that referral being open, so it's not closed, and to be able to reinforce that stuff, being the main point of contact with that young person when we have that contact with that young person.
So outcomes. We are only about 18 months into this initiative. We're funded until June next year. There is an evaluation occurring right now in relation to the Community Youth Response Initiative, and specifically in relation to integrated case management. Certainly our experts of data people, which is not me, but our experts are very clear that we need to wait for about 12 months post young people's exit from the framework before we can actually get some real and tangible data. But certainly some of the soft outcomes that we're seeing at the moment are quite significant in terms of young people's increased engagement in therapeutic, mental health and other community-based interventions, increases in education, increased engagement from young people and families as well. And when you're working with involuntary clients, increased engagement and motivation from young people and families to work with you, I think is a great determinant to tell you that, some of the things you are doing are working well.
I can share some positive outcomes that we've seen with the small number that we have been working with. Just briefly, we did have a family that had 3 individual or distinct integrated case management young people that we were working with, and we did work with them for over 12 months. But in that time, we've had 2 of the sibling group that were actually able to successfully finish their interventions and supervised orders and have not been back before the court since January this year. And whilst the 3rd is still before the court, that's the kind of significant shift that I think needs to be highlighted, because for that family, that's a huge shift in their functioning and their capacity to be pro-social within the community. Additionally, we've seen smaller, I suppose, outcomes such as a young person who was frequently before the court for offences that were related to their placement. And through working with their integrated case management, they were able to develop skills in how to communicate and negotiate with child safety, which eventually led to a working relationship between that young person and their child safety officer, which saw them be reunified with family. And these are the types of great outcomes that, whilst probably won't sell as many papers as the negative side of youth crime, they're the things that really need to be highlighted that have made a major difference in young people's lives.
Yeah, we're at the end.